Greetings. As perhaps you can see, the doctor is in today, and the subject is Bhanté Dharmawara and the Institute for Buddhology. So Samdaj Priya, the Venerable Bhanté Virabelong Dharmawara Mahatera, and I had the privilege of of living with him and facilitating for him, being his student and at times his physician, over the last 30 years of his life. Now, this particular moment, it's a bit appropriate for me to be in what's called scrub suit garb, because Bhanté was a scientist of the Buddha and a scientist of Buddhism, and he brought his head, his heart, and his hands to the meaningful labor that was available to him. And in the late 1980s, it might have been as late as the early 1990s, in that time frame, he became quite interested in the think tanks. He became quite interested in the places that evolved ideas into initiatives that eventually became policy and reduced suffering and improved quality of life, which was one of his Buddhist overriding missions. So after a few weeks of his being a bit quieter than usual, a bit more meditative and contemplative than usual, he said one day, "Ross, we need an institute of science to study the Buddha." I said, okay, because by then I learned that when he suggested something that didn't immediately click with me, that didn't immediately make logical sense, where were the resources going to come from? I knew about Stanford Research Institute. I knew about and had given presentations there on behalf of Willis Harman, who founded it. And I had participated in the World Future Society and the future scenarios on health, including what's called the transformation scenario. And I think Bhanté had heard about that years before. But it seemed to him time to bring the Buddha back to life, partly through historical reconstructions, and to study, and to live, and to experience and report on what Buddhism and the Buddha would suggest today for us in the 21st century, if they were with us. As I believe the Buddha was with Bhanté, or he with the Buddha, whichever way you want to see it. And the Institute of Buddhology came into being. There was letterhead, there were index cards, and there were business cards made. And Bhanté encouraged many up-and-coming Buddhist monks, including a most remarkable monk named Dhammika, who I believe is mostly in Singapore and sometime in Sri Lanka. And he has become a specialist on the medicinal plants that the Buddha articulated, and has brought back much of that information that is of interest to ethnobotanists, of interest to medical anthropologists, but really more of interest to those of us who are looking to nature to nurture us during the challenges of the 21st century. We know that many times we're exposed to small amounts, but potentially harmful amounts of toxins, that if we can remove them safely from our body, or in more safely ways remove them, makes us more resilient, less hospitable to afflictive biological health responses. So the Institute for Buddhology nominally sponsored some of the 2-week Vipassana silent courses that Bhanté gave over time in different parts of the United States. It encouraged monks like Dhammaka to get access to and report in literature, in books, in lectures, maybe even in YouTube videos about how physiology was encouraged by the Buddha. It would be consistent to say physiology before pharmacology. Clearly, the Buddha knew that too little was too little, too much was too much, and that just right was what was needed. It's called the middle path, and there are 8-fold ways to progress towards the center on the wheel of life. And one of the great insights of Buddhism and the Buddha was that the path of moderation may actually be an enabled and facilitated and rapid progression, spiritual progression path. That sometimes we need to withdraw, sometimes we need to be a bit more austere, sometimes it's okay to indulge a bit, as long as you bear in mind the responsibility, shall I say the karma or the consequence, that we now know extends over generations, from psycho-emotional experiences to nutritional adequacy to toxin exposures. It's now clear that over at least 3 generations, not only is our genetic code, our DNA, but also the translator of the genetic code, the RNA, which may be as or more important in the quality of our individual life. This is modulated over generations, as was anticipated by the Buddha, and as Bhanté incorporated into the Institute for Buddhology philosophy, the philosophy. Bhanté used the Institute for Buddhology mostly to encourage others to dig as deeply as he had. There were very little resources available at that time. By that I mean financial resources. There were lots of human capacity within Bhanté. But there was very little money, and he did not, to the best of my knowledge, ever ask anyone for money. Although if people wanted to invite him, they could cover his expenses for sure. And there were some people who were more than generous and gracious to either hosting him and enabling his work, calling attention to the quality that he lived, and that he infused into the Institute for Buddhology. After a few years, I asked him why no one had come forward to form a finance committee. We had a whole vision of what could be studied and what populations would particularly benefit, and what kinds of community-based initiatives we would take, because we could be very frugal, yet do meaningful outcome studies to document certain of the ideas, hypotheses, premises that Bhanté articulated from his studies of the Buddha and the early Buddhist teachings. The Institute for Buddhology exists in spirit today. Without Bhanté for the last 20 years or so, it has not materialized. I think he would be delighted to know that in Bihar province of India, on a place that was at one time a Buddhist university, Naropa University is emerging, and emerging as an institute of higher learning with a stellar global group that's calling it into being, including mobilizing the resources, leaders from Singapore and India, leaders from Thailand and Indochina, leaders from global leaders, all interested in a university built on the Buddha's teachings and Buddhist principles that brings together Buddhist scholars and Buddhist students so that there can be a renaissance, a flourishing of Buddhist culture and of Buddhist science. I think Bhanté would be delighted with that, quote, turn of events, and would pray for its greater success. On other times, I'll talk about other episodes where Bhanté was involved with educational institutions, especially those that were holistic, humanistic, and perhaps a bit pioneering. But these are my reflections on the Institute for Buddhology, inspired and initiated by Bhanté Dharmawara. And this is part of a series of recollections and homages to a most remarkable Buddhist leader, someone who embraced all of Buddhism and really all life forms on the planet, with an emphasis on reducing affliction, with an emphasis on giving us tools that help our resilience, that encourage our capacity for mood and neurohormonal balance, for being at peace regardless of the challenges around us, for living at the center of life as much as possible to create meaningful moments with head, heart, and hands working together.